I remember the day everything changed. It was warm for late September, the kind of quiet afternoon where the sky feels too calm for bad news. I was walking up the path to my parents' house, a bouquet of cheap white roses in one hand and a folded letter in the other. It was from Thomas, my fiancé. He had left it for me before heading to New York to finalize plans for our move. We had been together for 3 years through all the ups and downs, and finally, after months of job offers and housing applications, we were about to start a new life together. I wanted to share the news with my parents, maybe even hear something kind for once. Instead, I walked into a storm I never saw coming. The dining room smelled like old wood polish and fried onions, the kind of smell that clung to you long after you left. My father was seated at the head of the table, stiff and unreadable, while my mother arranged teacups that no one ever drank from unless guests were over. They didn't look up when I walked in. That was already a sign. My father's eyes were on the envelope I held, not on me. When I told them about the move, about Thomas and New York and the new job, the room turned cold.
My father didn't yell.
He didn't even raise his voice. Instead, he slid a crisp document across the table, his latest version of the will. At first, I didn't understand why he was showing me this. Then he said the words that felt like bricks being dropped on my chest. If I left with Thomas, I'd be removed from everything. Every cent, every property, every trust fund line they had ever planned for me.
Gone.
Just like that. I didn't know how to react. My parents had never liked Thomas, claiming he was only after money even though he came from a decent family and had a better job than I did. They said he didn't understand our values, that he didn't respect tradition. But deep down, I had always hoped they'd come around. Instead, they forced my hand. Choose your family, or choose your future. My mother's eyes were glossy, like she wanted to cry, but had practiced holding back. My father was a statue, stone cold and unshakable. It wasn't about love to them. It was about control. And they were done pretending. That night, I sat on my bed staring at the roses, now limp and browning at the edges. The letter from Thomas rested in my lap, creased from being opened and read too many times. He didn't know yet. I hadn't called him. I didn't know how to explain it. That my parents were making me choose between him and everything I had ever known. It wasn't just money. It was my home, my safety net, the life I was supposed to inherit. I thought of the house I grew up in, of birthdays on the back porch, of Christmas mornings with lights and cinnamon rolls. Could I walk away from all of that? Could I choose a man, even one I loved, over the family that raised me? But love is never simple, and neither is family. Over the next few days, my parents tightened their grip. My father called lawyers. My mother left printouts of the inheritance documents on the kitchen counter. They were serious. This wasn't a bluff. And the more I resisted, the more they pushed. My mother tried guilt. My father tried silence. Neither worked. And yet, I still couldn't pack my bags. Something held me back, a sense that there was more to this than just money or pride. I started asking questions about the will, about what was in it, about when it had been changed. My father brushed me off, saying he had updated it after I started dating Thomas. But something felt off. Too calculated, too harsh. I wasn't the kind of daughter who went off the rails. I had worked hard. I had never even borrowed money without asking. Why now? One evening, I stayed up in the old study room, digging through file cabinets and folders. My father had always kept every receipt, every document, every scrap of paper he thought mattered. He was organized to a fault. I found old tax documents, letters from my grandparents, insurance forms, everything stacked neatly. Then I found something else. A small, locked drawer I had never noticed before. It wasn't fancy, just a metal slide with a rusted keyhole. I knew where the key might be, my father's bedroom safe. And I knew the combination. He had once let it slip when he was half asleep after surgery. I had helped him punch it in. It took me only a few minutes to unlock the safe and find the tiny brass key. My hands trembled as I opened the drawer. Inside there were papers, old and faded, with the smell of dust and ink. And right there at the top of the pile was a handwritten will. Not the printed legal document my father had shown me, but a different one, dated almost 5 years ago. It was in my grandfather's handwriting. I knew his writing well, bold and deliberate. He had passed away just before I started university. In this version of the will, everything was left to me. Not just the house or the savings, but all of it. The land, the trust, the stocks, the company's shares. It was clear, unmistakable. And more importantly, it was witnessed and signed. This wasn't a draft. It was final, but it had never been filed. It had been hidden. The realization settled in like ice water in my veins. My father hadn't just written me out of the will. He had hidden the one that gave me everything. I sat on the floor for a long time, the paper trembling in my hands. Why would he do this? Why keep this hidden for years, only to show me a new version now, when I finally stood up for myself? The answer was as bitter as it was clear. Control. If I had known I already had it all, I wouldn't have played their game. I wouldn't have stayed. My father had rewritten the story, erased my name, and replaced it with one that served his needs. And now, when I was finally ready to leave, he tried to cut me off from something that was already mine. Everything shifted that night. My loyalty, my guilt, even my fear. I wasn't just a daughter stuck between love and legacy. I was someone who had been lied to, used like a pawn in a game I didn't even know was happening. And suddenly, leaving didn't feel like a loss. It felt like survival. But I also knew one thing with chilling certainty. If my father had gone this far to hide the truth, then he wouldn't stop now. And I had just become a threat to everything he had carefully built on lies. The next morning, the sun streamed through the curtains like it didn't know the world had just turned upside down. I folded the old will and tucked it into a book I knew my father would never touch, an outdated engineering manual from his college days. My thoughts were tangled and sharp, slicing through the memories that once made this house feel safe. I couldn't confront him yet, not without understanding what the consequences might be. I needed time, leverage, maybe even a plan. So, I pretended. I went downstairs. I made coffee. I answered my mother's questions about dinner like I hadn't uncovered a truth that changed everything. My father didn't look up from his newspaper, his face calm in that distant, unreadable way that made me question whether he knew I'd found the drawer. But if he suspected anything, he didn't show it. I started researching quietly. At night, in the privacy of my locked room, I looked up inheritance laws, will contestation procedures, and the legal weight of a signed document, even if it hadn't been filed officially. It turned out a valid will with signatures and witnesses could still hold power in court if proven authentic. My grandfather's handwriting was distinctive, and the witnesses listed were real. One of them, I discovered, still lived in town, a retired school principal named Mr. Granger. I drove past his house twice before I got the nerve to stop. When I did, I didn't even have to explain much. The moment I showed him a photo of the document, his face fell. He remembered signing it. He remembered my grandfather insisting on it. But he had never heard anything about it again. That alone was confirmation. My father had buried it. Probably the day after the funeral. The rage that simmered beneath my skin felt volcanic. I wasn't just cut off. I had been stolen from. And not just money. Stolen from the truth, from choices I had every right to make. I had always been told I was the emotional one, the impulsive one. But nothing about this felt emotional anymore. It felt calculated.
Quiet. Exact.
The next step wasn't loud. It wasn't revenge. It was documentation. I scanned the will. I gathered emails from years back where my father had admitted to handling the estate alone. I saved screenshots of texts he sent me about finances, ones that, now looking back, reeked of manipulation. Then I spoke to a lawyer. Not the family one, someone new, someone I found online after checking reviews like I was buying a secondhand car. She was young, sharp, and calm. She asked the right questions and listened without trying to steer me. And when I told her everything, she didn't sound shocked. She sounded ready. She told me to be quiet, to gather,
To wait.
So I waited. I played the dutiful daughter for a few more days. My mother kept asking if I had changed my mind about Thomas. My father didn't say much, but his silence grew heavier, like he knew something was shifting. Then one night I overheard them. They were in the kitchen, voices low, thinking I was asleep. My mother asked if they had gone too far. My father snapped that it was necessary, that I was slipping away, that Thomas was a danger, not to the family, but to his control. He said, "If she finds out about that will, we're done." The words landed like thunder inside my chest. He knew. He'd always known. I stayed behind the stairwell, clutching the railing so hard my knuckles turned white. The truth wasn't just something I had stumbled on, it was something he had feared. That night, I couldn't sleep. The weight of what I had heard pressed against my chest like concrete. But instead of crushing me, it anchored me. I wasn't imagining it. I wasn't being dramatic. My father was terrified, and that meant I had something powerful. I began preparing for the shift I knew had to come. I moved some of my belongings quietly to a storage unit Thomas and I had rented months earlier, before we knew any of this would happen. I told my mother I was just cleaning, getting ready to donate old clothes. She nodded, relieved that I was distracted. I smiled and kept packing. Then, just as things seemed to be holding still, the first real twist came. I received a letter. Not an email, not a text, but an actual letter sealed with a wax stamp, which felt oddly dramatic in modern times. It was from a man named Robert Daly, a former associate of my grandfather's who had handled some of his business dealings. He had been overseas, out of contact, and had just recently learned about my grandfather's passing. He wrote that he had been named as an alternate executor in one of the earlier estate drafts. When he called the house and my father answered, Robert claimed he was given vague answers and was told the estate had been settled with no issues. But something didn't sit right with him. He remembered a conversation where my grandfather spoke about leaving everything to me, about how proud he was of the way I had handled responsibility at a young age. He asked if I was doing well, if things had gone as planned. I sat on the floor of my room reading that letter again and again. It was like a voice from the past reaching out to say, "You're not crazy. You were loved. You were chosen." I replied cautiously and asked for any documents or proof he might still have. If he had anything that could strengthen my case, I needed it. Meanwhile, I stayed close, played calm, and waited for my father to slip again. And he did, faster than I expected. One evening, he stormed into my room holding a file folder I had accidentally left out. It was a printout of my scanned copy of the will. He accused me of sneaking, of betrayal. I watched him unravel, not with fear, but with clarity. He threatened lawyers. He threatened to cut me off completely, not knowing he already had. I didn't react. I let him shout, let him burn through every ounce of power he thought he still had. Then I quietly told him that I had already spoken to someone, that I had proof, that his time of controlling the truth was over. He froze. Just for a second. A flicker of something passed across his face. Fear, maybe. Or regret. I don't know which, and I no longer cared. He walked out without another word. The silence that followed was louder than any fight. The next morning he was gone. Not gone forever, but gone for the day, probably scrambling to cover his tracks. My mother asked where he went. I told her I didn't know. And for the first time in a long time, that wasn't a lie. I really didn't know what he was planning next. But I knew what I had to do. Because I had more than truth on my side now. I had momentum. And once you start peeling back the layers of a lie that deep, you never stop at just one. The day the court notice arrived, everything became real. I had filed the petition quietly, with the support of my lawyer and the corroborating witness testimony from Mr. Granger. The moment the papers were served to my father, the atmosphere in our home turned from brittle silence to barely veiled hostility. My mother stopped speaking to me entirely, her disappointment wafting through every sigh and glance. My father avoided being in the same room. It didn't matter. What needed to happen was already in motion. The court had agreed to review the validity of my grandfather's original will and investigate the potential concealment. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady, like someone who had finally stopped treading water and was walking toward the shore, even if it meant walking alone. I moved in with Thomas the same week. We rented a tiny apartment with creaky floors and chipped tiles, but it felt more like home than the house I had grown up in. There was no money to furnish it beyond the basics, but I slept better under that leaky roof than I ever had beneath marble ceilings. The town, small and nosy as it was, caught on quickly. My father began spinning stories, ones where I was the greedy, ungrateful child suing her own parents for inheritance she didn't deserve. He told neighbors I had been brainwashed by Thomas, that I was mentally unstable, that this was all some scheme to ruin our family name. But the truth has a funny way of lingering like smoke. People started whispering that my father had been unusually secretive since the funeral, that the estate had never been formally announced in public records like others had expected. Old friends of my grandfather came forward. Some said he had always talked about how proud he was of me. Others admitted he had expressed concern about my father's obsession with legacy and image. One even said, "I always thought it was strange he never mentioned your father in the last year of his life." That's when something else happened, something I hadn't planned for. A woman named Lydia reached out to me. She said she had been my grandfather's caretaker in his final months, employed privately, not through any agency. She claimed he had expressed clear wishes that I receive everything, and that he had grown wary of my father's behavior. She had kept a journal, something she said she wasn't sure she should share, but felt compelled to now. When she gave me a copy of a few pages, I felt my stomach twist. In them, my grandfather wrote of my kindness, of my patience when I visited, and his worry that my father was plotting something behind his back. He mentioned feeling pressured to hand over control of finances and having regrets about not making things more secure. It wasn't a legal document, but it was a moral one. It painted a picture of betrayal, and it filled in the cracks that the court hadn't yet seen. My lawyer was cautious, careful not to rely on emotions, but to use every piece of evidence to build a case that couldn't be dismissed. We submitted Lydia's testimony, Mr. Granger's statement, and the dated will with matching signatures. My father's lawyer argued it was outdated and invalidated by the newer will, the one where I was erased. But then Robert Daly came back. He sent documents showing my grandfather had mailed him a copy of the original will for safekeeping, along with a letter expressing concerns that someone in the family may not honor these instructions. That letter, written in ink with my grandfather's unmistakable tone, warm, protective, and deeply worried, became the final crack that split the floor beneath my father's case. When my father was summoned to a deposition, I didn't attend in person. My lawyer went in my place. But the aftermath echoed loudly. My father had been cornered by his own past, and the pressure showed. That night, my mother showed up at our apartment unannounced. Her eyes looked older than I remembered, the kind of tired that lives in the bones. She handed me a photo album I hadn't seen in years. No words.
Just that.
Inside were pictures of me as a child, hugging my grandfather, standing on the porch with scraped knees and a popsicle in hand. Tucked into the last page was a letter from him, handwritten, addressed to me. It hadn't been opened. The seal was intact. I looked at her, confused, and she whispered just one thing before walking away into the night. I wasn't strong enough to stop him. I opened the letter slowly. It wasn't long, just a page and a half. But it felt like a doorway to everything I had missed. My grandfather wrote about how proud he was, how he had watched me grow into someone strong and kind, and how he knew the world would challenge that strength one day. He said he had left everything to me not because of blood, but because of character. That family isn't just who you are born to, it's who you stand for when no one else does. He warned me, in gentle words, that not everyone would support my choices, and some would try to control my path out of fear or pride. But he ended it with this: I trust you to choose right, even if you have to stand alone. The court ruling came a week later. The judge ruled in my favor. The original will, though older, carried overwhelming credibility. Testimonies, documents, and the intentional concealment by my father proved enough. Everything my grandfather left behind was reinstated under my name. My father lost more than money. He lost the story he had tried so hard to control. He left the courtroom red-faced, defeated, and silent. My mother didn't come. She sent a single text the next day that simply read, "I hope someday you understand." I didn't reply. I wasn't angry anymore. I was just done. Some people call it cutting ties. I call it breathing freely for the first time. Thomas and I moved into a small house on the edge of town a month later. It wasn't grand, but it was ours. No more creaking halls full of secrets. No more whispers of disapproval in the walls. I set up a shelf in the hallway with framed photos, one of my grandfather smiling in the garden, one of me and Thomas on our road trip, and one of the letter my grandfather wrote, framed and under glass. It reminded me daily of who I was and what I survived. The inheritance wasn't just money. It was truth. It was dignity. And it was the freedom to choose my life without guilt. Sometimes, in the quiet mornings with coffee in hand and sunbeams cutting through the window, I think of the girl I was when all this started, torn, scared, aching to belong. She didn't know yet that choosing love wouldn't mean losing everything. That standing up for herself would mean finding herself. And that family isn't who holds your past, it's who respects your future. I didn't lose them. They lost me. And I walked away, not empty, but whole.